Sorry about this, by the way. It always takes forever to get started, and it's unclear when it starts. The Facebook design is not very...
You just tell me when I should start.
Yeah. It's simpler in person, I have to say. There's not this complications. Okay, well, apparently, so the event didn't... No, okay, the event has started. Great.
Okay.
So, welcome to our 7th event at the Oxford Economics Society this term. I'm Oscar, and I'm the Vice President of our Society, and I'm excited to welcome you back for another interesting presentation of economic ideas. Today, we are proud to host Professor Pranab Bardhan, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, to discuss universal basic income and its implementation in poor countries. This pandemic has had catastrophic effects on economies around the world, and most strongly in the global south. These desperate times have only increased the need for radical thinking as the shortcomings of past policies come to light. Professor Bardhan is among the most qualified economists to speak on this topic, having served as chief editor of the Journal of Development Economics for 18 years, and being an expert on the political economy of development in China and India. The talk will last 45 minutes, with 15 minutes of questions at the end. If you would like to rewatch this event or others, it will be posted to our YouTube channel afterwards. Make sure to send in your questions throughout the talk through our Pigeonhole page. I've posted the link on the Oxford Economics Society Facebook page. Thank you for joining us, Professor Bardhan. When you're ready.
Thank you. Good evening to most of you. Of course, it's just around noon in Berkeley, California, from where I am doing this strange thing, addressing you virtually. But by now you must be quite used to it. I have very fond memories of Oxford. I have been to Oxford many, many times. Not very recently, but in the past I've been a visiting fellow at All Souls College. I've been a visiting fellow at St. Catherine's College, and I've also been a visitor at Nuffield College. So I'm quite familiar with Oxford, and that's a great place that I always have loved to go. Today, my topic is universal basic income in post-pandemic poor countries. Now, why not rich countries? I'm going to talk about that just very briefly. But let me first say, during the pandemic, there have been quite a few programs in different parts of the world on cash assistance. So quite a few people then started also talking about why not the programs be graduated to universal basic income, which is not quite the proper thing to do, because the cash assistance program that you have in different parts of the world are not like universal basic income. It's mostly to the poor, whereas universal basic income is really universal, it's for everybody. It's unconditional. So in that sense, cash assistance programs and universal basic income is quite different. But people think about cash assistance as really part of universal basic income, and even though it's not exactly the same thing, it's in the same genre. But to have a universal basic income, you need a lot of preparation, lot of institutional setups, etc., which we still do not have in most countries. Let me first start with a bit of history of the idea. The idea of universal unconditional grant to all is quite an old idea in at least Western countries. It has been associated with, in Britain, for example, with Thomas More, his famous book on utopia, and very soon after him, in 1516, by his friend Johannes Vives, who also wrote on something like the universal basic income. It was taken up by Thomas Paine the end of the 18th century. In the 19th century, in France, Charles Fourier took this up. Charles Fourier is somebody Karl Marx discussed quite a bit, and he called Fourier a utopian socialist. But he certainly had this idea of something like a universal basic income. Later, John Stuart Mill, his famous book, The Principles of Political Economy, second edition, he took up this idea and developed this idea of Charles Fourier. In the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. took up these ideas. Then 3 Nobel laureate economists, Friedrich Hayek, James Mead. James Mead, by the way, was my PhD thesis supervisor. Then Jim Tobin. Jim Tobin, an American economist, he took it up actually not in academic work, but in connection with the 1972 presidential campaign of George McGovern, in which Tobin included a promise of what he called a demo grant, which is like the universal basic income. Then in more recent years, various green parties in Europe have talked about it. And the last presidential campaign in the United States, one of the Democratic candidates, Andrew Young, very strongly advocated a universal basic income. Right now, there are many experiments going on in Europe, different parts of Europe, in Canada, and in different parts of the United States. Most of them are in rich countries. On a country level, this universal basic income has actually been tried out as a policy in Iran in the beginning of the last decade, and I think in some version is continuing even now. It has also been tried out in the middle of the decade in Mongolia. But both, of course, are somewhat different, separate cases, because in both the money essentially came from natural resources, which both Iran and Mongolia have in great quantity. Let me briefly tell you my own trajectory. I have been involved in a group, international group of social theorists for many years. And one of these theorists happened to be a Belgian political philosopher, Philippe van Parijs. And Philippe has been a major advocate of universal basic income in Europe. I used to dismiss the idea as not very practical for poor countries. I didn't give it serious enough thought, but I could see that it's a very good idea for rich countries. But then gradually, I began to think that there's a lot of scope for it in poor countries. In fact, Philippe now tells me that maybe chances of a universal basic income are better in poor countries than in most rich countries. Why not rich countries? I think the one major issue is really financial, because the money that is be needed in the rich country context is extremely large. For example, it's been estimated that in the United States, if you give everybody, say, a $10,000 universal basic income every year, $10,000, by the way, is below the poverty line in the United States. But if you give $10,000 everybody, that's really going to break the budget in the United States. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it will cost, it will take up about at least 2/3 of the total US budget, which is of course then all these other items of expenditure in the budget, then if you want to carry those out, it will really break the budget. I'm going to show later that in poor countries, it's also very expensive. But in poor countries, it is financially not completely out of the realm of possibilities. And I'm going to share with you some very kind of back of the envelope calculations I have made for India. The other thing I want to tell you right away, that quite often people think of it as an anti-poverty program, but I'm not thinking of it as an anti-poverty program. Now, in what way is it different? Anti-poverty programs are usually targeted for the poor. Now, there are lots of problems in developing countries of targeting, mainly because most of the time, we do not have a good idea what is your income, what your income is. Incomes are not, in fact, for example, in India, incomes are not even officially estimated. This is particularly because in countries where a large number of workers are self-employed, and also often in the informal sector where no accounts are kept, formal accounts are kept. So it's very difficult to know who's poor, who's not. So this is a big issue. In the context of the anti-poverty programs, people talk about inclusion error and exclusion errors. Some people are excluded who are poor but are excluded, and some people who are not poor are included. These errors are quite large, and these errors afflict targeting for anti-poverty programs. The universal basic income is not also a topping up program. Topping up meaning, suppose you think about a minimum income and you want to make sure that everybody has that minimum income. And if you have just fall below, say, £100 of that minimum income, the program will top it up. Now, this is not that. Universal basic income is not that. There are many reasons, but one immediate thing is something that I just told you a minute back. We don't have an idea whose income is how much. So how could you top up? And this, of course, will generate perverse incentive for you to understate your income. I think also one important reason for universal basic income rather than an anti-poverty program is that anti-poverty programs work with a poverty line. So people below the poverty line are helped out by the anti-poverty program. But this ignores that particularly in developing countries, there are large numbers of economically insecure people who are above the poverty line, therefore are not helped by the anti-poverty programs. But they're insecure because they face all kinds of brutal risks. Some of those are weather-related risks, the rainfall being bad in some years, or floods, or some of it could be you lose your job, so job-related risks, or it could be health-related. Somebody in the family falls ill, the main earning member of the family falls ill, and the whole family then becomes devastated. And of course, this kind of risk has been exacerbated by the pandemic that we are going through. Another reason why universal basic income is supported sometimes is that it has support from the middle classes more than anti-poverty program, which is mainly for people who are below the poverty line. So there is political support, although that is not my main argument. I regard universal basic income, UBI, as a fundamental human right for minimum economic security. If you go to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which year was it? 1948, I think. Economic security is part of those universal rights. Of course, it's not followed, it's not carried out in most poor countries, but that's a right, a part of the Universal Declaration of Rights. And I regard UBI as part of a minimum human right for economic security. This is particularly important for poor countries for the obvious reason there is often no social insurance. If you lose your jobs, there's nobody's going to help you out. If you are too old to work, the majority of the population do not have a pension. Some government employees have pensions, but the majority who are in the informal sector do not have a pension, and so on. So very little social insurance. But one important issue which some people take objection to, they say, okay, you're giving money to the poor, I understand, but are you going to give it to the rich as well? My answer is yes. It is universal. And since I regard it as a fundamental human right, everybody should have it, rich or poor. Just as, for example, just to give you an example, I think every citizen in a country has a right for police protection. That's a right enjoyed both by the poor and the rich. You can always say the rich don't need police protection. They have enough money to have their own private guards. Still, I think it's a fundamental condition of citizenship in all countries that the rich also have a right to minimum physical security. And I regard minimum economic security conceptually in the same way, since it's a basic right for the citizen, the rich should be entitled as well. That, of course, jacks up the expenditure, the cost for such a program. I'll come to that later. There is also an important implication for the labor market. And that is, the UBI allows you to disentangle the issue of security of a particular job from that of economic security for all workers. If everybody is entitled to a decent UBI, then losing a particular job is less traumatic for the worker. Trade unions sometimes go on fighting for a specific job security, but you don't need that if you have everybody is entitled to a decent UBI. This is a big issue in discussion on labor reform in many countries, particularly in developing countries. Then let me talk about some special factors in poor countries which justify UBI. Number one, something that I've already mentioned, compared to rich countries, in poor countries, there are special problems of targeting and means testing to find out whose income is how much is extremely difficult. So there's a lot of corruption in anti-poverty programs because of the inclusion error. A lot of people who are not entitled to the anti-poverty program get it because of those means testing problems. In the UBI, there is no inclusion error. More or less everybody is included. Then in poor countries, the politics of redistribution is often centered around group-specific or individual-specific patronage, like job reservation. For certain groups of people, they get reserved jobs in the public sector. Jobs for the boys, what the Italians call lottizzazione. And various kinds of subsidies, subsidized private goods, food, fuel, fertilizers, credit. So these are all, some of these programs are justifiable, but conceptually, these can distort the nature of democracy, because these are mostly private goods which are given in some poor countries as a kind of patronage distribution from the politician. So you are a supplicant to the politician for those private goods. And this diverts policy emphasis away from public goods, roads, power, railways, things like that. And quite often those are underdeveloped because the government money is often spent largely on those patronage distribution of private goods and subsidies. So, and public goods can improve productivity and benefit everybody. So UBI, like other universal programs, like universal healthcare, universal pensions, those can mitigate the widespread prevalence of clientelistic favors dispensed by politicians. So it can also change the nature of politics. Another issue is that unlike in rich countries, a large fraction of workers in poor countries, as I've already mentioned, sometimes the majority of them work in the informal sector. For example, in India, more than 80% of workers, more than 80% of the workers are in the informal sector. One reason the labor movement is weak in those countries, and thus their bargaining power is low, is because the movement is fragmented by this formal-informal division. For example, organized workers, again to give an example from India, organized workers is a very small percentage of total workers organized, trade union organized. So trade unions represent a tiny island in a vast ocean of poor workers in poor countries like India. And also this is true also many sub-Saharan African countries. The labor movement is thus fragmented by this formal-informal division. A collective demand for UBI, as with other universal benefits like universal healthcare, can serve as a bridge between the two types of workers and can strengthen the labor movement. In some developing countries, the next argument, some developing countries, particularly in South Asia and West Asia, and in North Africa, the majority of women, adult women, do not participate in the income earning labor force. They do not have a formal source of income. So they are not sometimes a very large part of them are not what would be technically defined as the labor force, income earning labor force. In such a situation, you can imagine how this contributes to the low status of the woman, the adult woman within the family, because she's not earning, even though she does a lot of work for the family, but those are non-income earning. In that context, a UBI deposited in their account every month can go a long way in boosting their existing low autonomy and status within the family and can activate their agency. Next point, in developing countries, some occupations are often particularly stigmatized. For example, manual scavenging, garbage collecting, sewage cleaning, sex work, etc. These are often stigmatized occupations. People usually work in these occupations because they have no other alternative. UBI can provide them an escape ladder. If they want to go do that work, fine, but if they want to escape from it, there is a ladder. UBI provides the ladder. If even beyond socially stigmatized work, UBI can be a great relief for the stark livelihood uncertainties faced daily by the vast numbers of the self-employed and the marginalized casual and migrant workers and will help them in seeking better jobs. They are now in a very bad job, but they have to do it. But UBI will give them some relief so that they can take the time to seek better jobs. And more profit, if they are self-employed, more profitable investment. It will also enhance their bargaining power against, if they have a minimum income, floor income from UBI, it will enhance their bargaining power against the traders, the middlemen, the contractors, the employers, the creditors, and the landlords they encounter every day. The idea of UBI, let me go to the other side, problems with UBI. The idea of UBI often faces 4 general kinds of opposition. The first one is opposition from many common people, particularly those with strong work ethics, as well as some paternalistic leaders, that UBI will encourage laziness, an attitude of taking from society but giving nothing in return, and a possible inclination of some recipients to blow it up all in drugs and alcohol. That's one kind of opposition. Opposition from fiscal bureaucrats and conservative economists that it might break the budget. I've already mentioned it before. Opposition from social activists who otherwise want to help the poor, but some of them regard this UBI as a ploy to undermine existing welfare programs, particularly when they are working reasonably well. And this is the fourth kind of opposition from many that any extra money should better be spent on education, health, and infrastructure, which are seriously deficient in poor countries. So let me take these issues one by one. To start with, the incentive to laziness argument may be used against any income improvement for the poor. So you shouldn't do anti-poverty program, because if the poverty is removed or lessened, the poor will get lazy. So I find that argument not very plausible. In recent years, actually, but that you don't have to take it from me, there have been quite a few experimental studies on the effects of cash transfers to people in developing countries. The largest and the longest lasting one has been the ongoing study in 40 villages in Kenya by the Give Directly program. There is no systematic evidence that cash transfers discourage work or encourage use of drugs or alcohol. In addition, my own view on the possible work disincentive effect, by the way, the disincentive effect to economists could be from income effect or substitution effect, but there is zero substitution effect between work and leisure with UBI, because at the margin it's the same. But there is an income effect, it could be. But my own view is that any possible work disincentive effect, if anything, the poor are often overworked in backbreaking oppressive work. And it will be better if they, particularly women, can work a little less. So I'm particularly not worried about the work disincentive effect. But even in spite of that, if people are really worried about it, I follow this suggestion that was made by my friend, the late British economist, Tony Atkinson. He said, give everybody an opportunity. If they want to take the basic income, he was a supporter of basic income, take the basic income, but if they want to give back to society by doing some social service, etc., they will be encouraged. They should be encouraged to do so, particularly able-bodied people. Let me now come to something that I may take a few minutes on the financial viability, which, as you know, already I said, It's a big problem in rich country. Where will the money come from? It is a problem in poor countries as well. But I'm going to tell you with an illustrative fiscal exercise of a modest but decent UBI supplement. And the numbers I'm going to choose is from India, but I'm sure similar exercises can be carried out for other poor countries. So how much money can we generate? So I have, in my work, I have referred to studies made not by me, but by public finance economists in India, how much of the, to estimate the total subsidies. And then out of these total subsidies, how much go to the better off people. And the estimate in India, very briefly, is about 6% of GDP. 6% of GDP are, you might call them regressive subsidies. They mainly go to better off people. Number one. So suppose you take out this 6% of GDP. Then in most Indian budgets, there's an appendix where there are estimates are given of total number of tax concessions. They're called tax expenditures, or sometimes they're called revenues foregone. These are mostly concessions given to the corporate sector. By the way, some of these concessions may be quite necessary. For example, some import duties are exempted if you then use it for export. And that's a justifiable concession, etc. And there are other such justifiable concessions, but I don't think all of the corporate tax concessions are equally justifiable. In India, the estimate is about 6.2% of GDP are spent by the government in such tax concessions to the corporate sector. I'm saying, let's suppose not all of it, but we take 1/3 of it away. So let's say 2% of GDP. Add that to my earlier 6% of currently regressive subsidies. So that gives you 8% of GDP. Then I'm proposing extra 2% of GDP in fresh taxes. What kind of fresh taxes? India, for example, has zero taxation of wealth, zero taxation of inheritance, zero taxation of even high agricultural income. And in India, capital gains tax is very low, it's undertaxed, and all kinds of property taxes, local property taxes are also undertaxed. Altogether, and there are some other taxes I could think about. I have written about it. So altogether, I think it is possible. It will be difficult, but it is possible to have 2% of GDP as extra fresh taxation. So add that to my total of 8% that I've already accounted for. So that's 10% of GDP. And then I suggest take this 10% of GDP and divide it among 4 items of expenditure: health, education, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and the 4th should be UBI. Now, how much for each will vary from country to country. Right now, health expenditure is a huge priority. So it depends. But to put it very roughly, let's suppose we give 1/4 of this 10% of GDP to each of these items. Then UBI gets 2.5% of GDP. At that estimate, then you can give, I can give you only an estimate in Indian rupees. You can give each family at 2.5% of GDP for UBI. You can give each family for each year about 20,000 rupees. which is not a big sum, but it's not a very low sum either. I think if a family gets 20%, 20,000 rupees extra, it's a significant. It's not substantial, but it's decent. So I'm calling this fiscal exercise as a modest but decent UBI supplement. Of course, it's not all of your income, so it's a supplement, UBI supplement. So this will incidentally meet the other objections. Remember, it says, people say it will break the budget. I'm showing that most of it will not break the budget. And also, since I'm also taking care of health and education and infrastructure, the fourth objection was that. And since I'm not touching the existing welfare programs, so people who are worried that this is a ploy to get rid of the existing welfare programs, I'm not touching that. If that doesn't mean all the welfare programs are not are doing fine. There's a lot of waste in some of these programs. If you can do that, there will be even more money. But you don't need to touch those programs. In my remaining few minutes, let me talk just about some, first of all, about some other objections, some other implementation type objections. So for example, a major implementation problem is if the government is to implement it and say it's going to be deposited in your bank account every year or every few months or every month, that requires everybody to have a bank account. In poor countries, quite often, people do not have a bank account. And then issues of identification. How do you identify citizens? And how do you make sure that one doesn't double dip? So for that, say you need some kind of universal identification, which in countries like India and Indonesia are now quite advanced in getting universal, not fully there, but quite advanced in universal identification for citizens. It's not, say, and I've taken another large country, Nigeria, they're not advanced at all so far in universal identification. So identification is a big problem in some countries, not in India or Indonesia. But bank account is a problem. Quite often you are remote, you live in a remote area and there are no banks nearby. So there are many attempts now being made to have reach out the bank accounts to poor people. Still, it will take time. In India, the largest estimate that I've seen that there is some way of reaching banking service to about 80% of the people, not 100%. So this is one of the institutional setups that you will need for implementing. You cannot do it overnight. You need to set it up before UBI can be started. Another implementation issue is indexation. So as with inflation, the same basic income will mean less, in real value will be less and less over time. So there are ways of indexation. For example, the government, at the moment, government employees, when they get their pensions, the pensions are indexed or partially indexed with cost of living adjustment. You have to do that, that kind of a thing. Some people have suggested, why not make it, instead of an absolute amount, make it a certain UBI, a certain percentage of GDP, then as GDP goes up, it will automatically, the amount will automatically go up. Let me end by saying, politically savvy people will immediately point out that elimination of long-standing subsidies and imposition of new taxes will meet a lot of resistance, no doubt, political resistance from many quarters, and will be politically difficult to carry it out. While that is true, today we are going through a crisis, and I think this various kinds of crises are looming in our horizon. A crisis situation sometimes may soften up the resistance somewhat and may thus be an opportune time to try big changes. If for some time, the whole of the 10% of GDP that I said can be used in these 4 items, health, education, infrastructure, and UBI, is difficult to mobilize. Even with half the amount, one can start a UBI supplement only for the women as a pilot program. Just give it only to the women. Because that also, remember, some of the special arguments I've given for UBI is for women. I think I look at my watch and it looks like I'm exceeding my time. So let me end there. I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions come in. So this one ties in, this is a mix of 2 questions. So although universal basic income has received a lot of attention, other solutions have been proposed, and you've outlined a different one here. Here you developed that of cash assistance, for example. There's also,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Is my microphone on, or can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I just missed the last.
No worries. So, well, you've developed one version of UBI here, but there's many versions that exist. For example, there's a similar solution that has a similar rationale called UBS, Universal Basic Services, which expands the concept of the welfare state beyond education and healthcare to include transport, access to information, shelter, and food, all of which are basic necessities, participate in the modern economy. There's also the minimum income guarantee, which you outlined. And one of the audience members was asking, therefore, if you support cash assistance in the case of poorer countries, do you support minimum income in advanced economies? Should there be different solutions for different types of countries?
Yes, let me take the second question first. Yes, one of the problems I mentioned for topping up for minimum income is that we don't have an idea of income from the majority of the workers. Whereas in rich countries, it is much more available. It's not perfect, but the data are much more available. And in a sense, some countries have already that program already exists, even in the United States. United States is something called earned income tax credit. So if your earned income falls below a certain level, you get a tax credit to essentially top up. There are some incentive problems, perverse incentive problems of any such minimum income programs is that, so suppose your income goes a little above. Just think of the marginal taxation, because as you a little above, you have to pay a huge amount. In other words, you lose a large subsidy. So the cost to you of improving your income is very high at border. So there can be perverse incentives, which an issue like UBI doesn't have. UBI does not have that kind of perverse incentive effects. So I'm more in favor of UBI rather than just topping up minimum income. But of course, cost for UBI for rich countries is much higher. So I am, until that cost situation improves, I'm in favor of minimum income. Like earned income tax credit program, I think is a program I would support for the United States. Going to the poor countries of universal basic service, my problem with that, service delivery is much more difficult in poor countries. Just, let's give you an example again from India. India, now it's about 15 years back, a little less, India legislated right to education. So everybody in India has, all children have a right to education. Now, how do you reach out to these remote areas? Schools, there are no schools nearby. So huge amount of problems in getting schools there, the physical infrastructure problem, roads are not there. Secondly, even if the schools are not there, there's a huge problem of absenteeism. teachers, in fact, we have data now that about in 50% of schools, either the teacher is not there, I mean, on a random visit. It is found in several countries, including India, that 50% of the time, either the teacher has not come to school that day, or even if the teacher has come, he or she is not teaching. So I'm just giving this example. Service have a lot more problem. In that sense, universal basic income is a much simpler. But since, remember, the 10% of GDP I'm spending on health, education, infrastructure, and UBI. So I'm all for health and education program, but I'm very much aware for a long time to reach out to everybody, good quality education, good quality health service will take years and years.
Right, thank you. UBI is often discussed in conjunction with automation in the US and Europe, with the development of artificial intelligence, for example, and robotics. And UBI is then framed as a solution to these issues. Is this also the case in India? Are politicians increasingly worried about automation, or is UBI strictly discussed as an anti-poverty program?
In India, it's automation is not widely discussed. Automation there are robots, but the Chinese have a lot more robots than India. Robotization is not yet a big issue in India, but I certainly, I'm speaking to you from California. The Silicon Valley tech utopian entrepreneurs are all suggesting universal basic income as a solution when the digitization of work and robotization of work. I understand the argument, but I think it diverts attention from a much more serious problem, and that is why are we going to a technology that's going to replace labor? There are many kinds of technologies which may not necessarily replace labor, may enhance the use of labor. There are all kinds of technology. And I would suggest, even going in the digitization era, there are many ways in which the pattern of technological progress can be redirected from labor replacing to labor using. In fact, a very well-known economist at MIT, Darren Asimoglu, is suggesting exactly the same thing. He's written on this. He says there's a lot of scope for redirecting technological improvements toward labor using and therefore labor empowering direction. It's not that it's a given thing. All labor will be replaced. It depends on us, because the direction of technology is up to our own choice to a very large extent.
Right. What is your current impression of attitudes towards UBI among economists more broadly, and specifically as well among development professionals? Is it likely that we see the World Bank, for example, advocate for UBI within the coming decades?
I think much will depend on the fiscal feasibility issue that I've already touched on, both for rich and poor countries. The World Bank, by the way, has come out with a report on UBI. I think it came out at 2019 or so, last year. So they are discussing the issue quite a bit. But I suppose it will vary. And by the way, IMF also. IMF in their 2017 IMF World, every year they bring out this report called Outlook report or something like that. 2017, they made some calculations. They made some calculations for 6 countries, 3 of them, I think United States, UK, and France for rich countries, Brazil, Egypt, and Poland for not so rich countries. And the amount what they estimated is how much it will cost. This is IMF calculation. How much it will cost if you give every citizen 1/4 of the median income in the country. And they worked it out. And of course, again, as you expect, in rich countries, the percentage amount cost is much higher than in poor countries. In Egypt, I think it came to 2 or 3% of GDP. United States is more like 6 or 7%, and so on. So they are thinking about these things. But of course, these issues will be discussed. I think professional economists are, I don't know whether there is a poll. I know many professional economists support it, including, by the way, the last Nobel Prize economist in development economics, Abhijit Banerjee, has proposed his support for universal basic income. So it is being seriously given attention to. But I think the main reason it is not being discussed by many professional economists, certainly in the rich countries, is because of the fiscal feasibility issue. And there are others who are worried about the more libertarian people among economists, worried about the work ethics issue, which I discussed, that it will encourage laziness, etc. But as I said, so far, all the experiments, there's very little evidence of this will encourage laziness. And I very much, again, to repeat, I suggest that Tony Atkinson's idea that, okay, make, to the extent possible, everybody should contribute something. Even if there is a retired old person, he or she can weave a sweater or something. And it's more like a conceptual that you are contributing to society. You are not just taking from society. So it's possible to think about that kind of issues. But work ethic issue does bother many libertarian-minded economists.
Right. On that point, on the fiscal feasibility aspect, seeing the cost associated with UBI, it will likely only be possible to implement it if the government increases its revenue through taxation or closes handouts like you proposed. Does this mean that beneficial UBI will only ever realistically be implemented by left-wing governments? Do you know of any counterexamples?
I already gave you 2 countries which have done it, which is Iran and Mongolia, neither well known for their left practice. But they had natural bounty, oil in Iran's case, bauxite in Mongolian case. Oh, by the way, one state in United States have been giving out UBI supplement for what, last 20, 30 years, which is Alaska. Again, oil, natural gas. So they give it, I think they call it a permanent facility or something, permanent fund facility or something. Every year, it varies from year to year, depending on the oil gas revenue. Alaska gives out to every citizen a certain basic income. So it doesn't have to be. Alaskan government is a Republican administration right now. So it doesn't have to be a left wing. One of the advantages of the UBI idea, it's supported by both right wing and left wing, by the way. I don't know how many of you know, Friedrich Hayek, in one of his books, supported UBI. He says a liberal society has to have, everybody has to have a floor income. He calls it a floor income. So they sometimes, libertarians sometimes support it for the reason they don't support the welfare state because of its bureaucracy and wastefulness, etc. But they like the UBI because it requires not much bureaucracy. If you just, at the beginning of the month, you send out money to a bank account, it doesn't require a huge bureaucracy. So some libertarians are in favor. So one advantage of UBI, I think it cuts through across the political spectrum.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, Professor Bardhan. For everyone else, we still have one event left this term coming up next week. So please tune in. If you'd like to rewatch the event, it'll be available on our YouTube page. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you.